Well, it's my pleasure to be here to introduce today's speaker. Madeline Marquardt and I have known each other for over 15 years now. Madeline used to run an outfit called Tosan. Now it's Effective, but Madeline and her team do an absolutely fantastic job in the areas of leadership development, culture change, diversity and inclusion, just exceptional work. So Madeline today is going to talk about her journey as a transgender woman and the diversity of people who identify under the transgender umbrella. But also will expand to talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion and talk about how important it is. She and her team have done a lot of work, and actually Madeline was the brainchild behind actually the design of this space. We really set it up to be a different space to really encourage outside the box thinking, innovative thought. So thank you for that as well. So just a little bit about Madeline. After a lifetime struggle, Madeline, formerly Martin, came to accept that she is transgender, and in late 2017 completed a transition to living life as a transgender woman. While challenging, this experience has brought additional dimension and understanding to Madeline's approach to culture, leadership, and diversity in the workspace, especially the critical role that inclusion plays in how individuals and organizations succeed. She has had over 30 years assisting national and international clients to manage systematic change, and that's another thing she's done a wonderful job in, change management. I forgot to talk about that. Clarify strategic direction, structural redesign, culture, and develop leaders. Worked a lot in the nuclear space, actually did work here at Susquehanna plant, and has been doing work with electric utilities since probably 2009, 2010. So she and her team very much understand our company, our business, and quite a number of the people in our organization. So we're very fortunate to have Madeline here today. So Madeline, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dave. Actually, I've been working in utility space since '96. I don't tell people that. It really ages me. So I'm glad to be here in this role and in this presentation. I was Bill and I were introducing ourselves to each other and said, well, this is the first time you met Madeline. You actually met Martin a long time ago in Billings, Montana, of all places. So our paths crossed there. So I want to talk about diversity and inclusion, and especially about transgender, what that means and what it means to go through a transition. And I want to start with asking all of you here if you know why we celebrate Pride Month in the month of June. Shout it out if you know it.
Stonewall.
Okay, the Stonewall Inn. Some people would say riot, but actually it was a raid that then led to a riot. So it was an attack by the New York's finest, on a nightclub in Greenwich Village. And why they attacked that is because it was a place for gays to hang out and party and do what they do. So it was after that then the effort started in this country then to really push forward gay rights. So, and this I think kind of depicts where we have been with LGBT issues, and we are a long ways from that. But it goes, homo nest raided, queen bees are stinging mad. Now that was the headline in the newspaper, if you can believe that or not. So we have come a long ways, and we have a lot of people to thank for that along the way. So I want to make sure we all kind of just ground ourselves. We're here to commemorate that. We're here to celebrate the progress. And we're here to say we have a long ways to go yet. And we require a lot of advocacy on all of the issues surrounding LGBT individuals. I love diversity and inclusion. And Greg said that we were a part of the design of this lab, exactly the design of this floor. And I know I've been hounding Greg for a long time to do something. The timing's not right, the timing's not right. He is correct. I'm a little ahead of things all the time, which is great, I think, on one end. And then the time became correct for us to do something different with a space for a lot of reasons. What role did diversity play in this? A lot, really. Now, when you look around in this lab, what are some of the, what's one of the most noticeable things for you that draws your attention about this lab?
It's comfortable.
It is comfortable, right? What else?
Well lit.
It is. The colors, right? They're a little different than what the normal is. A lot of people see something right here. There's 3 of them and 1 out there. And they're the steel beams, right? And they tell a story. But that story was hidden. And is hidden, I think, on most every floor, all other floors. Did you expose them on your floor?
We did.
Okay. So that was hidden. And I use that as a bit of an analogy about diversity, because oftentimes diversity is hidden. But what's hidden here is tremendous strength. There also is a story. Some of you probably may have relatives that were the part of the creation of these beams, because they were manufactured over here in Bethlehem, at Bethlehem Steel. It was cool when we uncovered them because they had some Bethlehem Steel logos and information on it. But when I see that, I think about all the struggle that went in behind that, of all the progress that's been made in labor management relationships, you know, and then just the strength that's there. And when I think of diversity, that's what I'm looking for, that strength that lives in everyone. Now, what often draws us together is our sameness, and we connect on our sameness. But I think it's important to celebrate our differences and to really understand our differences. It's diversity that brings potential. The potential for this place and what it is today was in that diversity of people that came together to build this. And you can imagine the first time we started sharing designs, people said, no way. There's no way anybody in this place will go for that. The next one was, you couldn't possibly do that. The next one is, we don't do that, right? There's some beautiful orange furniture over here. You don't know how long it took to get orange approved. But those pieces of furniture were targeted to just be thrown in the dump. You know, they're beautiful retro pieces with a little bit of help and refurbishment, you know, add a lot of dimension to the place next door. But it all represented just potential. And it had to come together where people really started to listen with each other and to inquire into that difference. I know our design team came in here, worked with your design team and some other folks, and scared the bejeebies out of them. And I know that's because they called Greg and said, what are these crazy people doing? Because, you know, that design team we had there, I mean, it's youthful and vibrant and fast, and it took them all of like an hour and a half to say, here's your full design. You know, people are used to that being like a 6-month process. Right? But what happened is there are a lot of people that work here at PPL that blossomed. There are many things in here that didn't exist conceptually from our design that were added to once people found it was okay. They found out it was okay to add their value, to be seen, to be heard. And so then all of this was realized. So inclusion is what's there for realization of the potential. Inclusion's the multiplier. So we can have all the diversity in the world, but it doesn't help us. In fact, it often gets in the way if we don't then move towards creating the environment for people to include and be included and offer all they can. I'm not, this is a great quote. I didn't come up with this one, but I love it. You know, so diversity, you get, because all of you probably been to a dance, right? You get, wow, I got invited. But then who's going to ask me to dance? is always the next piece. And then the next one, will I make a fool of myself when I dance? Right? So being okay to then be different, to do your own dance is important. And then you heard this from your own executives, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's the right thing to do. I get it. I know it. I know it in my heart that it's the right thing to do. And in running a business, I know it's the right thing to do because it has tremendous payback for us if we have both diversity and inclusion, and we have to continually work those. How many of you are here because you're curious? Show me your hands. Okay, now that's an interesting question when you come to an LGBT event. Doesn't somebody, are you curious? What do you mean, am I curious? Could I even answer that question, right? Finally got that, right? Could I answer that? Well, it's essential for inclusion that you're curious. Okay, and it's curious about, how many of you are curious to learn? Show your hands, okay? Because that's what the potential is. The potential is here in the diversity, but you have to be curious to learn about that. How many of you are curious to seek out and understand the differences in people? Show me your hands. Okay, that's fantastic, right? That's probably why we're all here. Because I want to know where the rest of the people, and are they curious about that? And I have a lot of people that will come up to us in diversity and they say, well, I just don't see the differences. And I want to scream. I mean, one, you're living in an as-if world because it's right in front of you and I know you can see it. And the other part of that is you're denying a possible contribution of a person that has an experience far different than yours when you say that. Because you're simply not willing to inquire into, understand, and to use that. Okay? So that drives me crazy when I hear that. How many of you would say you're courageous? Show of hands. All right, you came up here. You demonstrated either some tremendous curiosity or was this lunch free? Maybe that's why you came. Okay. Hey, it's an important part of this.
You can get it, Greg, just don't rustle your back.
So, I mean, how many of you are courageous enough to put yourself into different experiences every day? Or frequently? You know, that's what inclusion and diversity and building understanding and capacity is all about, and it's required in organizations. Greg is a very courageous person. He's also, for me, been a very inspirational person. Outside of my family, he was one of the very first people I told about my transition. And it didn't take much of an act of courage for me to tell Greg because I know what kind of person he is. I understand the value system. He's fundamentally a very good, solid person, and I've known that for years. And I don't think you ever paused at all and just said, I'm sorry you've had to go through this all your life, and I'm here to support you in any way I can. And then away we went. And it was wonderful to hear that. And I will tell you, most transgender people don't run into that experience. Okay? So thank you for that. How many of you are courageous enough to be different? Fantastic, right? How many of you are courageous enough to be seen and to be heard? To speak up? Okay? It requires, that's all a part of inclusion in an organization. How many of you are courageous enough to speak out against repression, against harassment, against disrespect? Okay? That's another part of making an environment where people who are different can thrive and can offer all that they have to bring to the organization or just to their life. I want to talk a little bit now about, and switch and talk about what it means to be transgender. And from here on out, I want to talk about my experience because every transgender person has their own journey. And I do not pretend to speak for other people's journeys. I was invited to the opening of the LGBT Health Center of Excellence in Denver, Colorado, which is where I live. And the individual that led the creation of that center was so moved by the teenage people coming into Denver Health that had either attempted suicide or they saw people in the emergency room that had been almost successful. Over 50% of the youth either try or complete, the transgender youth try or complete suicide. And you know, why is that? It's important to, I think, to understand what's going on and why that happens. And when I talk about being transgender, and we do workshops, this is one of the models, if you will, we use around understanding diversity. It's called the dimensions of diversity. Other people know it as the diversity wheel. But it begins to explain a few things about us as people. So we start out with organizational dimensions, and they're about our experience as we go through work. We bring it into external dimensions, income, religion, educational background. From those two levels, I make choices every day, and all of you do too. And then we move into another level. We move into the internal dimensions, and then finally to personality. Some people think we make choices there. I believe we don't, in my own experience, in my own studies. And if we look further into that, and we start with personality, which is the easiest piece, how many of you have ever heard things like, oh, you're introverted or you're extroverted? You know, most of us have, right? And we have tendencies to be more move towards more introversion or more extroversion, and it's on a continuum. You can be anywhere on that. But that's part of personality, and that's, you may know that work as Myers-Briggs. If you go further into it like we do, that's Jungian psychology and the archetypes of people. And there are a whole bunch of other different dimensions about how we describe personality. And we don't know where it comes from. Heck, we may be born with it, as far as we can tell now. But we have personality. We don't make choices. It does bring about differences. We do spend time trying to figure out those differences and how we can take advantage of those differences. There's things called sensing and perceiving. One's far more intuitive. The other one uses more data. It's fantastic to bring those together. But they can conflict with each other. But then outside of personality, we have these other dimensions. I wished I could do something about age. I can't. I was born Caucasian. It's the genetic makeup I was born with. Ethnicity, I have a family history that comes from somewhere in Europe, and it played itself out. And our family still owns land that was first generation of Europeans coming to the United States. I have an attachment to land that's very different probably than other people because I grew up on that farm, and all my relatives grew up close to that. Physical ability, thankfully I have a lot of it. There are people that do not. There are some physical limitations you can see, there are others you cannot see. Then there's sexual orientation. There are some folks like to believe you can make a choice on that. I ask people exactly when in their lives they did, and what was that moment of flash when you said, okay, I'm going to choose to be this going forward. We don't run into very good answers when we ask those types of questions. Then there's sex. Okay, I came into the world with one, happened to be male. And then there's gender identity. And we run into some questions about that as well. And I'm going to talk more about gender identity. How many of you have seen the gender-bred person? It's been around for a while. It's a little aged, but she is aging well. But it helps us really understand where does the gender identity fit in this equation about us as human beings. And so we often start out with biological sex. So we were born. into this world. We were born male, female, or intersex. And here's the first place I ask people, because people then will say, well, your gender is associated with your sex or your gender identity. Not necessarily. Let's start at the intersex. What gender is an intersex person? You know, intersex person is both male and female sexual. What gender are they? That's an interesting question, right? How many of you know intersex people? Anybody here? When some you talk to, their parents or doctors, especially early on in previous years, made a choice for the child. And oftentimes that choice was based on a bias they had whether they wanted a boy or a girl. And just as often as not, it's wrong. Because as they grow up, their identity is very different than that. Then there's sexual orientation. And so in sexual orientation, heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, lesbian, gay, or with Miley Cyrus's help, we now have pansexual. Okay, which is just an attraction to human beings. It doesn't fit any of those definitions. So then we have gender identity. So gender identity is woman, gender queer, non-binary could fit into that, but not always. And then man. And it's innate. And most people, you have no idea. It's the same thing as you don't have any idea about your sexual orientation unless it's different than societal norms. Then you're highly aware of it. And the same thing with gender identity. For most people, their gender identity is the same as their sex. They're not aware of it, never made a choice about it, never had to think about it. But if you happen to be somewhere else on this, then you think about it. And then there's gender expression, feminine, androgynous, or masculine, okay? Now, you actually can choose a lot about your gender expression. Most everyone here, interestingly enough, is not cross-dressed today. Yeah? I mean, a few of you are, but most of you aren't. Right? And what do I mean by that, right? You can wear clothing associated in the norms of society belonging to the other gender. Women, you have a lot of leeway with this, right? Men, not so much. There are some judgments made about you quite quickly if you show up in feminine clothing, okay? But we have some choice about how we express ourselves in terms of gender. So I was born male. I have done some transition through the power of medical procedures and have transitioned to female. I'm also, and have been all my life, heterosexual. Although when my wife and I go out and we're affectionate in public, we're seen as a lesbian couple. She is heterosexual. Gender identity, so I have identified as a woman, and I do my best to express as feminine, and I've done mostly a pretty good job on everything but voice. And that's been I've trained my voice for years and years, and so it's challenging, and my therapist says you're just clinging on to something in the past, and so it's in good nature that she does that. Okay, so let's see, younger people, I would say today, have it a lot easier than us with age because there's far more fluidity and acceptance. Although we were working in a common workspace area in Denver, and the average age of the people working in this place were probably 22, maybe 24. It's just a lot of startup companies come into these places, grab space. Yes, there were dogs in the office. Highly creative energy going around. I probably triggered this conversation, not that I'm narcissistic or anything, but all of a sudden there was a lot of conversation on the floor about transgender people. And the younger people were confronting some of their friends and saying, I don't understand at your age why you could have issues with transgender people. And these were 20-year-olds talking to each other, like it's an old person affliction or something. So there's, I think, far more fluidity. When we talk about transgender, though, it's about people who have a kind of this innate gender identity. It's in here. I will tell you, it's in here. And it's different than the gender we were given at birth. Right? This innate knowledge, I mean, some people, when did I know? Probably, it's one of my first memories. And it's different for all people. I mean, there are 2 or 3 year olds that know, they just know. I was more like 5. And I had this realization, I was walking through this huge closet, just filled with all kinds of different clothing from all of us, like put away in this closet. And I walked through my mother's and sister's clothing, and I just were in the midst of that, because you get the back to the closet, and we had little forts and things back there. I just had this realization that came over me and said, oh, wow, what is this? Oh, this is right. The rest of this, not. And at that age, I had no way or no words to give that voice, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it was just there, okay? And I tell people, well, can you make a choice about gender identity? I said, I spent 55 years trying not to choose a different gender identity than was in my head, and it didn't work. Oops, sorry, jump one ahead. I have some handouts for you, and I forgot to grab one for myself, so if you could borrow one to me, I would appreciate that. Most everything I've talked about, I've tried to summarize in these handouts. On page 3, though, there's some terminology here that I would like to talk about that fit under the umbrella, transgender umbrella. Thank you for using that, Greg. So I'm a transgender woman, so I was born a male, and I've chosen to identify, live, and transition and live my life as a woman. Oftentimes people use trans. It's usually kind of a slang term. If you use it with people you know, it can be a term of kind of endurement and connection. It also can be used as a term that's meant to be demeaning, so be careful how and when you use the word trans. There's transgender men, so born as a female, but had a gender identity as a man, and then most people will end up transitioning to live life as a man. If you're not transgender in this room, you're cisgender. And cisgender just means that your sex and your gender identity match each other. It's a Latin word that means the same gender, so of the same sex and gender. There's transsexual, which is an older term. It's sometimes still used these days to refer to people who've decided to go through a transition, although it's not used much at all in our community. There's genderqueer or just queer. And again, that can be a loaded term, but that's a definition people can use who have different views on gender identity, not necessarily associated with transgender. It's not a synonym. Don't use it that way. Ask permission to use it for people, because people my age know what queer means. And it's a derogatory term that was used. So meanings of words change over time. Gender nonconforming is a more recent term, and it's used for people who don't see themselves fitting into any of the designators that we have for transgender these days, and also don't use it interchangeably with transgender, because there are people who can be offended by that. So as my good friend Roger Buffalohead, who was a Ponca Indian, said when we were doing workshops and people would ask you, well, what do I call you? He said, the first thing you call me is Roger. Then the second thing, he said, you can identify me as an American Indian because I'm from the Americas and I'm an indigenous person. And the third thing, if you want to spend time talking to me, you'll find out I'm a Ponca. And you can then talk about my tribal affiliation as a Ponca Indian. Okay? So the same thing if you meet a transgender person, just ask them, what would you like to be called? How would you like to be referred as? Okay? I wear this because it's a reminder for people, because my voice triggers people. I understand that, and I'm going to get that, and I accept that my voice are going to trigger people to use him at times. It simply says she, her, hers. Okay, so it's a preferred pronoun that I have, and most transgender people have preferred pronouns. We just need to ask them. In the middle of this is a cross-dresser, probably the least understood for people. So it's just, it's primarily men when it's referred to cross-dresser, although it can be women. But again, we don't necessarily see it. It's more socially acceptable. For men, it's not so. But it's people who occasionally wear women's clothing or makeup or accessories. I will tell you, there are a lot more cross-dressing people than you know. I know New York cops, I know presidents of companies, I know politicians, I know teachers, I know physicians, I know surgeons that are all cross-dressers and do it secretly so you would never know it. But it helps them manage their gender identity, and most of them are very successful in owning businesses, managing business, being physicians, and that's how they manage themselves, okay? So those are terms that are oftentimes under transgender. So with that, let me spend just a couple minutes talking about my personal journey. And what I would ask you to do is, again, keep in mind everybody's journey is different. It could be different than mine. So I'm speaking from my experience. I've already told you the realization came to me at 5 that I was different. In my family that I grew up in, it was definitely not safe to talk about that for a lot of reasons I'm not going to go into. I coped by going internal with it and keeping it there. And so one little bit of denial, burying it, living in secrecy, and I got really good at it. And I did that successfully probably into my 40s. And then I was having trouble just keeping that in. And so it started to come out, and I was allowing myself in secrecy opportunities for a different gender expression. In my mid-50s, I would say it began to become unbearable. And what was unbearable is it's a sort of anxiety, it's called gender dysphoria. It's a horrible term. I mean, I know the Latin meaning of it, but it sounds horrible. But what it is that anxiety of having to live with an external expression in a body, also a physical body, that didn't match with how I experienced myself inside. And so every day, that anxiety is there. And it kept building and building, and I managed it, but what it was doing is taking so much of my capacity, and there's no excuse for this, but I really took that out on people who were close to me, and it was beginning to destroy my marriage, and was beginning to destroy relationships with the people I held closest. And it was interesting, because I just recently had a bunch of them together and made some amends for that, okay? And it's interesting, because all the time I'm doing this diversity work and about acceptance and all these things, right? But I was good at denial. So in my very late 50s, I was found out. And I was found out by my wife. And so while it was extremely shocking for her, it was a time for me that I could just come clean with it all. Interestingly enough, she's been my strongest supporter. She is a wonderful woman. Less than 10% of the marriages stay together going through this. So I'm very fortunate on that point. She sent me to a transgender conference, said, go figure this out. While I was there, I met an incredible psychologist who's done some of the leading edge and writes most of treatment for transgender people. She actually was from near Philly, although when I met her it was in a different city far away from Philly. And I asked her to be my therapist, and she agreed. And so through her support, through my wife's support, through my family's support, I came to a conclusion based on a question my therapist asked me, and the question was this: how old do your people live? And I said, well, I don't know, late 80s, mid 90s. So she looked at me and said, you have a third of your life left to live. How do you want to live it? It was one of those, okay, right? Oh, I get to make a choice. And so through the support of all the close people around me, I made a decision to transition, to fully transition. So I have done that. I've completed the physical aspects of that. For those of you who don't know, that's done through hormones and through some surgery if you choose. The picture on the left in the red blazer was when I was starting. The picture in the middle is when I was more than halfway through it. The last picture, which I tried to edit out as much of that wine glass as I could, was last Friday night in Denver. My hair is horrible, but our 7-year-old grandson shot that picture. And I really, for me, it just represents the bond I have with Cindy, my wife. So I'm here. I told Greg about this probably at least 2 years, maybe a little over 2 years. And he's been supportive of me all the way through this, as I have been incredibly welcomed by the family here at PPL. I guess one of my biggest trepidations was going to be working with a group of linemen. After like a half an hour, it was not an issue. And a lot of them knew me because we worked out in the field with them. And in fact, I was a lineman in telecom at one time. My father was a lineman in electrical. My grandfather, both of my grandfathers were linemen in AT&T, way back when you planted poles by hand. So somehow that's in our blood, I guess. Okay. So I have a last piece on the state of affairs on the last page of this. You can read this on your own. I will give you a couple of highlights of that. In the last 18 months, I will tell you straight up, there's been what have been identified as 27 civil rights attacks on transgender people by the federal government. And so where a lot of progress has been made, there's been a tremendous amount of regression. You spent some time in DC. Do you know Myra Kingsley? No. I'll look up Myra Kingsley, the National Transgender Equality. She's a wonderful person, one. Has great connections, but I would really appreciate if you would knock on her door and let her, you know who you are. I've told her about PPL and how supportive you all are here. So there was some legislation coming up against transgender folks in the Pennsylvania legislation a year ago, I think. I said, hey, if you all can help out with that, the community would really like that. And I know you support your community and the people that provide support to transgender youth and just the LGBT community at large. So thank you for that, and I will take any questions you have, and if it's out of bounds, I'll tell you so, and we'll not have an issue with it. I'll just say I'm comfortable answering that. Next question. So what questions do you have?
I have a question.
Yes.
I want to know where the red jacket and the jean skirt is.
I thought about wearing those today, but then I was more comfortable. I went with this. It's in my closet. That's where it's at. Yes.
What's been the best thing since you're yourself now? What's been the best thing?
You know, even though this was not easy on our family, we have 3 sons, and they range from 44 to 38, 37, yeah. To do the math. It was shocking to them. Their first thing was, I'm sorry that you've gone through this. We love you, we'll be supportive of you. And each one of them did what it took for them to come to their own terms with this. And because there's a loss of an image of a father and a whole bunch of things that go with that for them. And our youngest son actually sought out and got some therapy for himself in this. And seeing that, grandkids, oh my gosh, they're like 5 minutes. Yeah. So they figure out their way of going through this really quickly. The 2 youngest, they call us Grandma Cindy, Grandma Madeline. Our oldest grandson, just Madeline, because he's been in a family where we've had a family business. Our son works for us. He has called me by my first name forever. We don't use dad, mom, and work settings. So that part has been great. We live in an unbelievable community in Denver. It's in the heart of a very diverse neighborhood. We have fantastic friends, lawyers and physicians and very, kind of accomplished people who live in this particular place, but cool, let's go on. So those have been the best parts, and then for me personally, oh my God, the load that's been lifted off, I can't tell you what it is. I have so much more of everything. So, thanks. Yes, now, can you agree?
Okay, so a question I have for you, since you're coming from Denver, Colorado, as you can tell, Allentown's a little bit of, it's coming together. We're in a place where inclusion and diversity is something that we're continuously striving for. So what is some advice and some tips for a place that is not exactly the most liberal?
That's a really good question, because I haven't had to be in a place where we had to change it. We moved intentionally into the gay community of Denver, and walking down the streets, men couples would walk by and said, oh, another breeder couple moving in. So had to kind of deal with that as well. We have Colorado Springs right down the road. You can't get much more conservative than that. So we have this kind of fight, this duality that's going on. We've drawn a lot of people to Denver, and they come there because it's an open, accepting environment. It's highly innovative. It's growing rapidly. 10,000 people a month are moving to Denver. And it represents tremendous diversity. So I would have a hard time saying that, but I will say this. Our former CEO of US West, Jack McAllister, and when he was the CEO of Northwestern Bell before that in Omaha, was serving, that's weird, sorry about that, serving at the time the federal government filed, people sued AT&T, and the result of that was a consent decree. Jack McAllister said, I'm not going to do awareness workshops because they don't make any difference. I'm going to change the hearts and souls of people. And our business support groups were established in 1981, coming out of that consent decree. Our Black Managers Association was huge, and we invited in people from other businesses. So we were touching all parts of the Omaha area, and we raised money to give out 20 full-time scholarships to disadvantaged youth in the community. So the business became really engaged in the community itself, to the point of business leaders coming to Jack McAllister and saying, would you stop this? Because our employees want this too. And he said, and continued on. And when he went to Denver, he did the same thing for Denver. He started the first GLGB, I can't remember, it was just only gay, lesbian, GLB, bisexual, GLB. One of the first GLB centers in the United States was started because of him and his advocacy for that. So I would tell you that it probably doesn't happen in communities without a strong partnership, and you are actually establishing that partnership with business leaders, and for them to just step out and start doing what needs to be done around celebrating diversity and managing inclusion. So that took me a while to get around to that, but I cried when I read his obituary because he was a fantastic human being.
I was just wondering whether or not your perspective has changed at all. So I think you're a master at culture change and development. Having gone through this, has that changed your point of view about how best to affect change and diversity, inclusion, all those aspects?
Yeah, I'm learning that, but one thing I'll tell you is I have more courage now to put it in. Where people would say, oh, I don't think you should touch diversity, I say, no, we're going to touch it. And so it's gonna be a part of more about everything that we do, and especially the inclusion piece of that. Has it changed my perspective? Yeah, I mean, it has. I don't know really how to describe it, but I just don't see things the way I have seen them in the past. I understand struggle in a way I've never understood struggle. We have a dear friend, African-American man, that we met him, had just been pulled out of a dumpster, close to death, and have taken Eddie in. Kevin knows Eddie Swait, the dear friend of our family, and I've seen how everything that he encounters is stacked against him, and it's unbelievable. So I have a far greater appreciation and awareness and see things like that where I didn't see them, and it's becoming, I'm having a different perspective every day, so I'm growing into that. Yes, Bill?
You've worked with PPL for many years now, and do you have any suggestions for what can we do better to engage and embrace, all the diversity and inclusion, but particularly on the transgender side? Is there something we're not doing that we could be doing to be helpful, but it could be broader than that, based on what you've seen from us thus far?
I would encourage you to do more, I'll call it a deeper level of work, especially with your management team, about helping them see their own internal programming. You've done some unconscious biases, but that's here. I would encourage you to go deeper, because then I think your leadership team can make better decisions. And in those opportunities, I will tell you, there was a person that, and we did some of this work with folks, but a person that went through that then went back and engaged a number of Middle Eastern descent employees that he had, and started asking them questions. It's far more inquisitive than he had been. And in the course of that, they found it safe to begin to talk. And he said, it's like they have blossomed into incredible employees. So I know things about diversity in my own life experience and with others, that diverse things scare most people. And when they're afraid, they avoid or they attack it. Most of them avoid it. And so I think we have to help people come to face with what I would say is the long-term program that they have inside them that clouds how they see the world, so they can be in a place of choice and overcome, step through that fear, and then they can see tremendous things. So there's just so much potential here, and I think, from what I've seen, you would do a really pretty good job of attracting diverse folks here. You don't necessarily keep them very well. And I don't know that you necessarily cultivated that environment where people just really go after that differences and celebrate that and bring that out. And that's why we're here in the Innovation Lab. Because you cannot really innovate unless you bring in the people from the fringe. The people that are in already had all their best ideas. That's why we're here today. It's the people that are out on the outside of that have a different perspective that'll help us break through to the next level of performance. And so that's one of the reasons that can we do this in the diversity lab, because it's so critical. So that's my short answer.
I think that's great, because I think if we can ask from an inquisitive perspective to describe, their life outside of the office, what makes the person tick, that to me is a much better avenue to go than some companies are going in the direction of, let's have the challenging conversation, the difficult conversation, and then kind of tee up, in my view, kind of from a negative perspective, not from the positive perspective. So you're bringing out a lot of things, and that's great, but maybe there's different ways to bring it out, and I'd like your idea of maybe bringing that out at a deeper level as opposed to maybe too superficial a level.
Yeah. And we're strong advocates of appreciative inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
So you're inquiring into the success, the goodness of people, and you're building on that. So, and you have to find a way for that fear and barrier to come down, and then people will do that. There was another question, I think, in the back. Yes.
Yes. So I'm looking at some of the statistics on the back of your handout.
Yes.
Are they doing
It depends on your community.
Yeah.
In Denver, what I'm familiar with, in our schools, there's not so much necessarily education, although there's some, there's acceptance. And there's celebration. Like Danny was coming to school last year, now Danielle is coming to school this year. Isn't that wonderful? And so that's more of it versus just, I would say, like formal educational processes. And then ease of access for people and breaking down barriers to that access is what I think they're doing more with the youth. And then there's a lot of outreach and investment. Denver Health, if you don't know, it is one of the leading hospitals in this country for providing health care to people who can't pay. And they do it for the whole Denver community and still operate in the black. And so with very little input and funds from the community. So we are very fortunate because they do lots of outreach into the schools themselves, and they actually have clinics in 12 of our public schools for transgender, or it's LGBT focused, but it's primarily serving transgender folks. So you could advocate for that. I don't know who and what your medical services of last resort are here in the Allentown area, but you can advocate for that. We invest in our inner city in Denver, and we are willing to pass taxes and tax ourselves to do that. Not many communities are, but we have rail systems, we have unbelievable parks, we have fantastic museums, we have the largest theater district between New York and LA. So we have that all going for us. So I see we're about to say, hey, you all can go. Any other last questions? Well, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. I have a very strong kinship to the folks here at PPO I've developed over the years, so it's great to talk to you in this capacity. So thanks.
Thank you.